This is Phil Palin. I'm going to give you a quick overview of a research project on hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria that CNA recently completed. This research project really focuses on supply chain resilience. What we've done is on April 1, we were asked by the National Academies of Sciences to do a very quick field research in Harvey, Irma, and Maria impact zones to better understand what happened to supply chains for critical commodities in each of these three events. We were assigned to develop case studies, a very particular way of organizing the research. It's narrative-based. It's organized around a lot of evidence-based stories. And we've outlined those in a document that is available here online. These case studies and have been presented to the National Academies of Sciences expert panel, and they've been presented to FEMA leadership, and we're rolling them out in a number of other discussions to try to inform policy, strategy, operations, and even tactical development related to supply chain resilience, especially in potentially catastrophic events. Supply chain resilience is especially important when the power is off, and it's going to be off for a long time, and you have a cascading set of problems with telecommunications and other critical infrastructure. In those kind of situations, you want to be sure that supply chains for water, food, pharmaceuticals, medical goods, fuel continue as much as possible, especially if you've got a long-term grid outage. Harvey was a quickly emerging storm, hit a very less populated area of Texas, and then slowed down considerably, but then wandered over 6.3 million people in the Houston metropolitan area, where it just sat and kept dumping inches and inches of rain. And so when you get into the eastern part of the metro area and toward Beaumont and Port Arthur, 40 to 50 inches of rain hit over a 3-day period. The problems in Houston were not even over. We were barely into the end of the response period when Irma came barreling across the Atlantic, made a hard hit on U.S. Virgin Islands, took out 1 million people's power in Puerto Rico. And on that Sunday night, just before she hit Florida, many of us were thinking it was going to be a catastrophic hit, potentially on Miami. If not on Miami, the surge models for the Tampa Bay looked horrific. Instead, she sort of wandered around like a lucky drunk. She certainly hit Key West very, very hard. But then she came in on one of the least populated areas of Florida and continued through many of the least populated areas of Florida, dumping lots and lots of rain, but otherwise not having a huge impact on a dense urban area. In Houston, all of the principal features of critical infrastructure were maintained. So the power stayed on, telecom stayed on. It was a very close call for the water systems in Houston, but they stayed on. In Florida, it was a hard enough hit, even in the middle of the state, that the power went down, but the power grid was robust and it was resilient, and it was designed for resilience, having pre-deployed almost 20,000 folks to help restore it. In the case of Maria, if you look at these three factors we've been talking about in terms of density of population, the impact on the dependencies of critical infrastructure, and distance from sources of supply, you really had a triple whammy, because you had a very powerful storm that hit a very distant, densely populated target and took down all of the dependencies. first power, then telecommunications. Road networks were in a very significant problem. So you had those catastrophic cascades that become so troublesome. Now we think we've actually seen important, coherent lessons that can be derived from all three of these events. First, we observed recognizable networks behaving the way that networks behave. There are nodes and links, connectedness, clustering, centrality, influence, flows, especially flows or impediments to flows that are called bottlenecks, continuity, and adaptation. But the main point here is that you see in all three of these events demand and supply networks behaving in predictable ways. We observe the humans inside these networks making choices that influence the behavior in the networks. Now, if these people were already embedded in the networks, they usually made pretty good decisions. If they were coming in from outside these networks, the decisions were not quite as trouble-free in our findings. But in any case, whether the people inside the networks were inside or from outside the networks, in either case, none of them had a good idea of what was happening across the networks. They were making their decisions on informed guesses, not on any sort of data evidence. So what do we mean when we're talking about recognizable networks behaving in recognizable ways? Well, here's an example. State of Florida is a big state, a very populous state. Despite its geographic and range and enormous population, it really only has 6 major fuel terminals. That kind of clustering, that kind of centrality is very common in high velocity, high volume, mature networks. In the map at the right, you see a different analysis, a post-event analysis, where we tried to identify where those areas of the state are that are most distant from the terminals. Not surprisingly, the places that are most distant from the terminals are also low-density population places. And lo and behold, if we had seen this map ahead of the storm or during the storm, we probably could have predicted that right there at Gainesville, in the middle of that deep red zone, where I-75 and the Florida Turnpike converge, was where the greatest shortage of gasoline was experienced. This distance from supply and convergence of demand is once again the way that networks behave. Here's another example of clustering and centrality and concentration. Once again, this is what high volume, high velocity, mature networks do. They don't just do it in Puerto Rico or Florida or hurricane country. They do it everywhere in mature economies and even some less mature economies. And so up in the upper right corner of this, you see the port of San Juan Bay. And this is where 85% of the commodities consumed in Puerto Rico enter the island. Less apparent is this area that's about a 4-mile stretch just west of the port, where you have all of these food wholesalers and you have 2 of the biggest fuel terminals. Right here in this 4-mile stretch, you probably have 70% of the food capacity and about an equal amount of the fuel capacity for the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. This kind of concentration is common, it can be found, it can be predicted, and therefore steps can be taken to develop relationships with the key players that are represented here, to look at mitigation together, and certainly to prepare for response and recovery together. So networks are behaving like networks, and then we observed humans inside these networks making decisions to try to influence the behavior of the networks. And here is literally the money slide. What was actually happening in the Puerto Rico grocery network was an enormous surge of supply. Certainly some grocery stores closed, but most of the grocery stores opened within the first week. In our interviews within Puerto Rico, it was frankly hard to find grocery stores that had not opened the next day. In the landfall area, there is one large, beautiful grocery store that is a major source of calories for everyone in the landfall area. It opened within 3 days. It continued to be open every day, right through till when it finally got the grid back in March. As these sales figures indicate, not only were the grocery stores open, they were selling more than usual, which obviously demonstrates they were being supplied more than usual. There's one wholesaler, again in that food corridor that we just showed you on the prior slide, that on the Thursday, 1 week after landfall, was pushing 7 times normal supply out to its grocery store customers. It continued at about 3 times normal supply all the way through the middle of December. But none of this surging supply for groceries or for fuel or for a number of other commodities was really known by anyone either outside these supply chains or even on a network basis by the people inside the supply chains. They were too busy pushing supplies out to begin to look at how their competitors were doing. They only knew that they were pushing everything they could. And the government, frankly, thought that the supply chains had collapsed. So networks were behaving like networks, and people inside those networks were doing the very best job they could to allow them to surge into a very different kind of demand. But very few people knew, perhaps no one knew in real time, that this kind of network surge was happening. On the Sunday after landfall, this resource request came in from the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. It was generated on a rainy, dark Sunday afternoon when very little could be observed moving around the island. And in fact, retrospectively, we can confirm that very little was moving around the island on that Sunday or the next Monday or the next Tuesday or even the next Wednesday. And so people that did not understand supply chains made a very reasonable choice. They assumed that all of these supply chains had collapsed, and the only way that the survivors in Puerto Rico were going to be fed was through FEMA providing about 6 million meals a day. This is what this request required of FEMA. This is what FEMA spun up all of its possible efforts to supply. We now know that the observation that this request was very reasonably made upon was incorrect, because by that Thursday, wholesalers were moving 3 to 4 to 5 to 6 to 7 times normal volume out to the grocery stores. The grocery stores were open. Pharmacies were opening. The supply chain was proving to be surprisingly resilient, but that was not obvious when this request was made, and it remained a secret for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks as FEMA and the Commonwealth and the mayors attempted to set up a replacement supply chain to serve the people of Puerto Rico. Those are our principal observations. Networks behaving like networks, people within those networks trying to surge them as much as possible, but no one having any clear understanding of what was happening in the networks. We derive three strategic or operational implications from these observations. First, that in Puerto Rico and in the vast majority of disasters, the private sector supply network and the public sector relief channel are really just two parallel systems. They're not aware of each other. They very seldom make connection with each other. The replacement relief channel assumes that the private sector supply network is down. The private sector supply network almost ignores the relief channel. Private sector supply capacities are, however, orders of magnitude much, much larger than the public sector relief channels. So especially in a catastrophic event affecting a dense population, about the only way that survivors are going to be fed is with the private sector supply capacities. That's something that smart operators on the ground in Puerto Rico noticed very, very quickly. And operational adaptation was made to help the private sector supply chain surge. But that was not part of the pre-existing plan. That was not part of the pre-existing strategy in dealing with this potentially catastrophic event in Puerto Rico. And so perhaps the most important strategic or operational implication of our observations is there really are significant opportunities for the public sector to unlock these constraints and facilitate the resilience of private sector supply chains. That is an important mission for FEMA, for the states, and even for local emergency management. Because in a catastrophic event affecting a dense population, you're just simply not going to be able to feed the survivors with the kind of capacity that only the public sector can bring to bear. That public sector capacity remains very important for gap filling. And it could have been even more important than in Puerto Rico than it was, as we'll get into just in a second. Maybe the best summary of what we learned was really offered by a shipper walking the docks with me near Jacksonville. And this is what he told us was his explanation of what happened in Puerto Rico. And basically what it suggests is that the flow necessary to serve survivors had survived. The capacity to maintain that flow had survived. One of the things that was most difficult for that flow was actually trying to cram the relief supplies into the same flow moving out of the port of Jacksonville into the port of San Juan. Just to reemphasize the difference between public sector capacity and private sector capacity, these charts demonstrate how all of FEMA's meal distribution was a very, very small part of the actual flow of food on which the survivors depended. Just as in Texas, all of the FEMA water that was supplied was a very small portion of what even just one smaller city required in Texas. So, based on our observations coming out of Harvey, Irma, and Maria, the most important interventions that FEMA, the Commonwealth, the mayors, the state of Florida, state of Texas, Harris County, other jurisdictions made in terms of really facilitating serving the dense population of survivors, was to open up the pre-existing flow of the supply chains, whether that was water, food, fuel, in all of these areas, by clearing debris off the road, by making sure there was fuel in the truck stops, by providing generators to critical facilities that did not have backup power generation in Puerto Rico. In all of these atypical mission interventions, this was how the supply chain was brought up. If FEMA had been able to receive close to real-time information on how the supply chains were behaving in this event, it would have also allowed FEMA to more precisely target where its mass feeding assets and other similar assets could be best targeted. The reality is that in metropolitan San Juan, and even 3 miles from landfall, the grocery supply chain came back very quickly. But there were other places, especially in the mountainous interior of Puerto Rico, where the FEMA food mission could have been very, very important, especially in the first 3 or 4 weeks. And if FEMA had been able to focus on those key places that were most in need and not being served by the private sector supply chains, survivors would have been much better served, and even economic recovery would have been accelerated. So, based on these observations and this obviously retrospective analysis, the research team has identified these 5 big takeaways. We suggest that as a regular practice of catastrophe preparedness, that emergency management identify the most at-risk, densely populated areas. Densely populated areas are the ones that are most in need of the pre-existing supply chains, and where any effort to replace those supply chains are unlikely to be successful. So identify these most at-risk, densely populated areas. Probably pay attention, especially if they are distant from other sources of supply, and if there is any indication by either current infrastructure or the nature of the risk, like seismic risk, that the grid or telecommunications is likely to collapse. Those are especially important areas to focus on for supply chain resilience. Once you've identified these places, identify the key nodes and links for water, food, and fuel in those places. And we're talking here about grocery distribution centers and fuel racks and all sorts of water sources, both public and private. We're suggesting developing a sentinel system. We mentioned that players inside the existing supply chains were able to see how their supply chain was behaving and were able to make well-informed decisions about how to surge their supply chains. Well, find those people ahead of time and hook them in with each other and with public sector emergency managers, so that the whole system can begin to self-monitor even during a crisis. Give particular attention to hourglass structures. I'm going to give you just a little bit more on that in a second. And then with all these 4 prior elements in place, this really provides the kind of structure and information necessary to reconceive emergency management catastrophe response strategies and to avoid the collapse of critical supply chains during a crisis. Okay, bullet number 4, give particular attention to hourglass structures. What on earth does that mean? Well, in high volume, high velocity, mature demand and supply networks, there is a repeating pattern of hourglass structures emerging from the activity and sometimes the space in which these demand and supply networks operate. This happens especially in high volume, high velocity supply networks, because to get supply to demand with dense populations, with really, really diverse demand, you've got to move them through a waste, a set of functional modules that speeds them and gives them direction. If they're just all coming down together without that sort of speed and additional direction, they will not get to the right customers at the right time. And so fuel racks are created. And intermodal containers have been created. For all of human history until 1956, you have a lot of bulk cargo going into ships, and that bulk cargo tends to be both put into the ships and taken out of the ships in pretty awkward, labor-intensive ways. And then all of a sudden, trying to deal with the increasing density and expectations of demand in the post-World War II economy, you see the development of these steel containers that facilitate much more targeted, much speedier delivery of materials across the maritime networks, totally revolutionizing really the global economy. Well, this is the way, this is an example of an hourglass structure and a very modularized, adaptable function at the waist. But whether this is fuel racks or intermodal containers or cross docks or a number of other module functions at the waist, in peacetime, these things speed and target. In crisis, these very same functions can become impediments of their own. Because what's happening, these have been engineered to certain reasonable expectations of both supply and demand. And especially in a crisis, as we've seen with groceries in Puerto Rico, we saw with fuel in Harvey, Irma, and Maria, there is this surge in demand that far exceeds the ability to deliver supplies. In all three of these events, there was plenty of supply, but the ability to deliver the supplies were troubled. And so we are seeing this as a potentially very helpful operational focus for preparedness, response, and even recovery, to begin to identify what are these functional modules at the waist of hourglass structures that persistently cause problems. Identify them ahead of time, figure out mitigation plans for them, and develop a professional competence to be able to recognize when you fixed it at the waist, and so the bottleneck starts morphing somewhere else because of the way you fixed it. So these are not static things that you're going to be able to fix and just forget about, but it is a way to reduce the potential impediments to the throughput of supply chains by action you take before the crisis, and then be informed about how to view the crisis in real time to do further mitigation during the crisis. This is a satellite view of the largest single fuel terminal in just west of San Juan. And what you see here, in our judgment, is one particular example of a functional module at the waist. That item at the waist is the fuel rack. There are only so many bays in that fuel rack. There's only so many trucks that can move through those individual bays. It doesn't matter how much supply you've got at the right-hand side of the picture. It doesn't matter how much supply you've got at the left-hand side of the picture. You're only going to be able to move as much supply to demand as you've got capability at that waist. Can you expand that waist? What would an expeditionary fuel rack look like? What would opening hours of service at the fuel rack do? There are a number of different mitigation measures that could be taken, especially if you begin to identify these sorts of impediments at the waist before the crisis and begin to engage. A whole lot of food in San Juan. There wasn't enough food down at landfall. The roads were open. There were enough trucks. There were enough containers to carry the trucks. The real problem near landfall was the lack of an electronic data transfer device that would work so that people with the local version of SNAP cards or food stamps could purchase grocery products in the landfall area. That became an impediment at the waist of the hourglass structure. Lot of supply in the mainland United States, lot of demand in Puerto Rico. That maritime lane between the Port of Jacksonville and Puerto Rico had 16 ships regularly making the rounds before the event. They increased that throughput by 40%. They looked at a lot of other ways to create throughput. Recognizing this sort of hourglass structure and potential bottleneck ahead of time and taking steps ahead of time is the fundamental notion that we suggest are coming out of the 2017 hurricane season. So, we observed demand and supply networks behaving with significant, really surprising resilience. Especially in Puerto Rico, it was really, really bad. And still, the fuel, the food, and even the water supply chains came back with amazing speed and volume. We found that government in general, emergency management in general, does not have an effective means for monitoring the resilience or the non-resilience of these demand and supply networks. Everyone was blind, but it was especially difficult that the public sector was blind. Because the status of the pre-existing demand and supply networks were mostly unknown, public sector assumed the worst. Very reasonable assumption since they could not observe what was happening, but then they took action that actually suppressed the supply chains that were really what was most important to support survivors. There are sources and methods available that would provide everyone in the network greater awareness regarding the status of demand and supply networks, and this would allow emergency management and others to support the resilience of supply chains and to target the gap-filling assets that only the public sector can bring to bear. That targeting is so important because there are only limited resources available to emergency management, so applying those resources where they're most needed is critically important. Fundamentally, emergency management in Puerto Rico, in Florida, in Texas did things in the 2017 hurricane season that were successful in increasing the resilience of critical supply chains. Those were done usually on an ad hoc basis by smart operators responding to the crisis in real time. We're suggesting be much more effective to recognize that this is a core mission. Facilitating the recovery and sometimes the redirection of private sector supply chains is the way that dense populations are served after a potentially catastrophic event. And it's the way that you avoid a catastrophe when the grid and telecoms are down for the long term. If you have any questions, check in with CNA. Happy to answer your questions or your concerns.